the conversation that we have with ourselves when we're listening to what's being said or what's happening in the world, that conversation determines the entire quality of our life.
Yeah.
Welcome to Settling's Not an Option. I'm Adam Nebbs, and I'm here with my co-host Amanda Stanhope. This show is for anyone out there who feels like they've settled for an unfulfilling life. Whether you've settled in a relationship, the work that you do, or how you feel about yourself, we're here to tell you that settling's not an option. If you're liking the show, please follow us on Spotify, Amazon Music, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have any feedback about the show or want to recommend a topic, you can email us at cheers-to-not-settling@gmail.com. Finally, to conclude the plug, if you feel so inclined, you can donate to us on Ko-fi, where we're aiming to buy some new audio equipment. Our guest this week is the amazing Kylee Stone. Kylee is the founder and CEO of the Performance Code, Team Women Australia, and host of the Uncharted Leader podcast. She's a certified coach in the neuroscience of resilience and an expert in transforming leaders. She's also a mum of 3 kids, which, given all the other hats she wears day to day, is super impressive. So welcome to the show, Kylee.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We look forward to seeing how this conversation is going to go. So
yeah. I'm impressed. I was like, are you talking about me? Was that my intro?
That's awesome. I know, because we don't think of ourselves like that, do we? Until someone else points it out. Yeah,
that's exactly right. You're like, well, really? Am I doing all those things? Yeah, I'm clearly, in the context of settling, I'm certainly not settling.
No, absolutely not. Exactly. Sometimes you just have to have someone point it out to you.
Exactly.
That's right. All right, so I'm going to hit you with a hard one right off the bat here. No.
No. Right.
No.
I better get on the edge of my seat then, huh?
No, I feel like you'll be well prepared to answer this one. But so I was looking at your website yesterday on the Performance Code's website. And I saw this quote on there that just grabbed my attention. And I just wondered if you could describe a little bit about what this quote means to you. So, and what really is behind it. So it is, we're in an era of leadership that demands the transformation of oneself to navigate disruption, lead with compassion, and accelerate growth despite adversity. So what does that mean to you?
Yes, to me, that means that everything that we need to fulfill on what's important to us as human beings, not only as human beings, but also to be able to achieve what we want to accomplish in business, is all within our own reach. It is the resource. I've often said to people that the greatest resource that you have to anything, to fulfillment, to freedom, to power, to love, to joy, to whatever it is that has you be fulfilled, is all within you. And I'm careful not to be cliche about that, because of course every time I hear myself say that, I immediately think of Tony Robbins. Sure. They're it's the power's within you, and I go, oh yeah, hold on. Because I'm not, if any, those who know me very well. I'm very black and white, practical kind of, I'm a researcher by background, right? I mean, I started as a data scientist and a researcher, so I'm your numbers lady, right? I'm not the fluff. So when I would hear things like that traditionally, I'd go, oh God, here we go on one of those woo-woo things, right?
Yeah.
But the thing that really struck me is that the conversation that we have with ourselves when we're listening to what's being said or what's happening in the world, that conversation determines the entire quality of our life.
Yeah.
And so for me, when it comes to the transformation of oneself, for me, it is to be clear about and to develop an awareness of what are the things that I do say to myself when I'm out there in the world, or when I'm in the privacy of my own home, and what is my interpretation of what's happening, and are my actions consistent with what I really want or not? And often what happens is that how I act and behave in the world is usually consistent with what's happening in the conversation I have with myself.
Okay, sure.
Does that communicate?
Oh no, that makes perfect sense. Yes, and I could not agree more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, the second part of the quote is really about the first thing in particular is to then choose to start with leading with compassion.
Yeah.
And, that one to me is really important because in a world where there is so much, let's just say, crisis or chaos or ambiguity, as a human being, in the way that our brain is designed, it is natural that our automatic reaction to that is in the fight flight zone.
Yeah.
And most of us are either afraid, uncertain, cautious, or and then judgmental on ourselves and or others about our capability of doing that.
Right.
And look, to be really frank, for me, I spent a large majority of the first 30 years of my life being incredibly tough on myself, and discovered that actually I need to really start with leading with compassion for myself.
Yeah.
To stop giving myself such a hard time. I mean, at the point that this happened for me really was when I had 3 children in under 3 years. And
oh gosh.
yeah,
Holy
all
cow.
separate, by the way, no twins in there.
Okay. Wow.
And
Yeah.
I was so driven in my career. I was an executive leader at the time, and I was just drive to be harder. And at one point, I'm pretty sure someone said to me, like, really, are you really? And I I just really had to stop and look and went, God, cut yourself some slack here,
Yeah,
like
that's a
really,
lot.
this is not only is it just 3 children and you've got a senior executive role, like I was working in the print media industry, and, we're in the peak of digital disruption. So businesses was restructuring. We were taking $41 million worth out of the business. It was chaos, really.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah.
So the compassionate part for me, I think this is why it's really, like in some respects for me, what I went through 10 years ago in 2000, and it was really 2011, so almost 10 years exactly, is very much on repeat about what's happening on a global level right now.
Sure.
On a micro level, having 3 children in a leadership role, dealing with, working at News Corp, which is globally one of the biggest media organizations in the world. And that company itself at that point in time was really being turned upside down. Thousands of people losing their jobs, thousands of people being made redundant. And so for me, this is a repeat. It's like literally press the button, repeat. And I think if anything now, absolutely, we have to look within for ourselves. And absolutely, we have to start with giving ourselves some compassion so that we can breathe.
Yeah, I love that. Now, does that extend? So, of course, you have to give yourself compassion, but I imagine that you extend that outward as well. Or how do you see that, I guess? Is it one creates the other? When you have compassion for yourself, you then in turn have compassion for others?
Well, it's certainly more natural. When you go through, because it's not even just a matter of saying, oh, I need to be more compassionate to myself. Well, that's sure.
Yeah.
But, having been through that for myself, I can be really frank and say, it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as waking up and telling oneself, I need to be kinder to myself. Well,
right.
that because, I'm not sure if, I know there's an interest here around mental health as an example, right? There's a neuroscientist out of America called David Eagleman. And I recommend anyone Google David Eagleman and no free will, because even though we might say to ourselves, yes, be kind to yourself, wake up and you're going to start this day, and then you walk out the front door and you experience a bit of road rage, and all of a sudden what you had intended doesn't show up as a reality. And that's actually not got anything to do with us. It's actually to do with the wiring of the brain. There is no free will. The brain will trigger whatever it does. So I think firstly for me, it is absolutely about paying attention to what do I need to do to bring compassion to myself.
Okay. Very
distinct from, okay, absolutely put attention on what have I got to do to bring compassion to the person who's just road raged, because there's a whole world behind whatever they might be dealing with. And that's a very separate piece, right? Very, very separate.
Yep.
But I do know for sure that when you really do get masterful, and you look in the distinction of masterful, it takes 10,000 hours to be masterful in anything.
Okay.
So when we do become masterful in that practice, I can absolutely say for sure that the compassion that happens for those outside of oneself is natural. It is actually, you get actually, once you've gone through paying attention to what's needed to be kind to yourself, you really do get how difficult it is for other people.
Yeah,
and
sure.
it's a very natural thing to do.
Well, I love that you point out that 10,000 hour thing, because I think that's important for people to realize, because we so often expect ourselves to change overnight or see results overnight. So I'm very glad to hear you say that, because I think that maybe you just give our audience a little breathing room, you know, to have some time to change. You're not going to change overnight. You're not going to be compassionate to yourself overnight.
Yeah, and I think it's the same with things like the imposter syndrome. I think that would clearly show up where, you know, and I've heard a lot that comes up when people get into, you know, they take a step up, you know, they get into an executive role or they get into being a CEO of a company, and then they're kind of like sitting in that seat going, oh my God, am I going to get found out, right? And from what I've seen, that absolutely shows up for people before they hit their 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
hit your
sure.
10,000 hours, and there is an undoubt, like, you got no question whatsoever over being discovered about anything, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I almost want to jump in and kind of ask about the neuroscience a bit more, but we've reserved that for a bit later in the conversation, because I think
you can jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, if that feels good.
I guess my question was around, because I really like, you know, how you talk about, you know, it's about the wiring of the brain, you know, and you just think, I guess the reason you'd almost need those 10,000 hours is because you've spent probably however many hours over the years building these neural pathways that are just these negative same thoughts that automatically trigger as soon as you do something, no matter where you are. And somehow we expect, you know, okay, I've had a few different thoughts today, so therefore that whole pathway is going to change. So I'm just curious, I guess, like, what was your process, I suppose, of rewiring your brain, you know, so that maybe those automatic thoughts don't trigger like they used to, I suppose.
Yes, I think you bring up a really good point there, Adam. You know, I haven't done the math myself, and I guess it also depends on how old one is, on the math about what they're out to wire, right? I mean, I'm 48 this year, so there's a good chance there's a number of times 10 in there somehow. And you know, I think firstly what I would say is that it's like, my experience firstly is that it's like an onion. You know, when you take the first layer of an onion off, and then there's another layer and there's another. It's kind of my experience in going through rewiring the parts of my brain that have shifted into, like, let's just use the compassion as an example, right? From not being compassionate and being incredibly harsh and judgmental to, you know, really being able to automatically shift to compassion, really was like the peeling back of an onion. And so, you know, and the thing about it is you don't actually know what's on the first layer until you take the first layer off.
Yeah.
You know, so the discovery in itself is actually part of that. So the process, if anything, is being okay with, you're going to work on a layer that's going to get you to a certain point where you have a certain amount of freedom, like taking that first layer off. And then what you discover under that is really unpredictable. You know, we talk a lot in today about the uncertainty, but, you know, uncertainty is an illusion. Life has always been uncertain. You know, you can't predict what actually is really going to happen tomorrow when we wake up, right? Really, like, really.
Yeah.
And the process, Adam, is just like that. When you discover something and get an access, and then you just naturally find yourself taking a new action, all of a sudden you end up with these new discoveries about something. So that's the first thing I would say. The other thing that I'm very passionate about, and this is one's very closely connected to my culture. It's not, you know, people who look at me and, you know, I've got blonde hair and white skin and blue eyes, and I look like a traditional Western woman, Caucasian, and but I'm an Aboriginal woman, and so I have white skin, but I have a very dark, rich culture. And storytelling, as anyone would know, for any Indigenous culture, no matter where you are in the world, whether you're, you know, in the United States, or you're in South America, or you're in Australia, but the Indigenous cultures, wherever you go, they are connected and have the experience of connection from what we call storytelling.
Okay.
And storytelling is not, for us, it's not just about the telling of the story, it's about listening and our ability to, you know, you imagine like the first kind of nations people of any country where there was no, you know, before the industrialized world, where you would sit around a campfire and you would have people telling stories. Well, there's no distraction in that. Like, you're not sitting there going, oh, I need to check my iPhone, or oh my goodness, you know, what's happening in the world over there, or someone's making a phone call. Well, no, actually all that's really happening is like a child sits there and listens to a person, you know, reading a storybook. They are just in, you know, in the story. They are like, you know, the imagination is just going, wow, you know. And the thing that I discovered is that, you know, as a human being in today's society, what tends to happen is that listening is no longer pristine. It's no longer a space of nothing. It's filled with a lot of stuff. And, you know, I think Brené Brown did us a lot of justice when she started getting on the public stage about storytelling, but more talking about the stories or the narratives that we have about ourselves. And so for me, I like to, you know, reflect on storytelling as a process that one could apply to get power around the conversations that are in the wiring of our brain, because the conversations that do show up in our existing wiring are automatic. They are wired from when we're a very young age. And from a neuroscientist perspective, there is a development that we go through as a human being, and certain ages are all predictable. And, you know, when we, for example, something happens at a certain age, you know, you're at school and you stand up in the front of the class, for example, and you get the answer wrong and someone laughs at you, you don't just brush it off, right? You sit back down and you go, oh, I'm so stupid. And then that decision called I'm stupid gets wired in your brain. And then you, to compensate for the decision that you're stupid, you decide that you've got to be really smart. And next thing you know, this person's 50 years old and they have 2 masters, a PhD, all to prove that they're not stupid. But who decided they were stupid in the first place? Oh, well, it was a reaction to some child laughing at them when they were 6 years old standing at the class and they got the thing wrong. You know, so when you apply the principle or the practices or approach, however you want to call it, of telling me your stories, well, you could just see right there, I told you a story of a 6-year-old standing at the, you know, I tell you that story. It's very clear in that you can hear, oh, what decisions did you make? Oh, that I'm clearly stupid. Oh, is that true, or is that a belief? And then you go, oh, right, that's a belief. Oh, and that's why, you know, so you can start to then unfold. Firstly, it's about the identification of what are the things that you had wired in that brain of yours to begin with, because unless you're clear about that, then you don't actually even know what you're unwiring. I mean, if someone looks at a person who's doing a PhD and just, you know, would they have ever thought, oh, that person is clearly stupid for themselves? No, actually, no, completely the opposite, right? So you can't even work out what it is that you're up to when it comes to wiring, because everybody's different. Despite every human being being the same, when it comes to the way that the mechanics work, every single human being has a unique story, and you can never predict what it is that is, you know, their thing when it comes to the wiring. But I absolutely say for sure that storytelling itself is an incredibly powerful access.
Damn, I listened to another interview of yours, and the host actually said, I think we could talk for, you know, a few hours. And I get that, because
I know, that's what I'm like.
Like,
how long do you have, Kylee? No.
Yeah, we're gonna have to do a few parts. But you know what's interesting, what I like, so like I'm very engaged and interested in what you're saying. So you're, you know, obviously you can tell this is in your DNA, storytelling. Because straight away I'm immersed and intrigued and curious and asking lots of questions in myself. And I think that's good. It kind of harks back to what you said about the importance of listening. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, that we've lost the ability to listen, not just to each other, but to ourselves, and realize, what's driving all these behaviors and causing me, I suppose, to kind of settle in an opinion of myself. So yeah, thank you. That's a nice revelation that I'm going to sit on and think about a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks for saying that, and I like your reference to the DNA, and I certainly thought from my approach, really, it's been a 10,000 hour job. Let's just say that, right? So it is not in my automatic wiring to just, to be really frank, to even want to communicate to people.
Okay.
Right. So for me to be in a conversation where there's absolute freedom to not only see that, but really that comes from now my passion for storytelling, not just for the discovery, but it is in sharing one's stories actually also that transforms what's possible for other people. And I think that's, that is the power of storytelling. When you tell a story, people are engaged. People want to listen. People want to connect with you. They want to. And that's why I'm very passionate about that, because I do really believe, and there was a quote by the Dalai Lama about that, that the planet does not need more successful people. The planet desperately needs more storytellers. Because, ultimately what we're desperate for at the end of the day is connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that reminds me, unless, did you have another question, Adam?
No, you go for it. Yeah.
Well, I was going to at some point ask you about, you've just been described as an authentic leader. And I think that storytelling ties into that, because I wanted to ask you what that means to you to be an authentic leader. But I think that storytelling ties into that a little bit. Would you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Firstly, for me, being authentic actually starts with telling the truth that who we are as a human being is fundamentally inauthentic. So, if we look, and I think the easiest way to make that practical in terms of how we can see that is, we show up to work with a smile on our face and doing things that are really great in the world. And in reality, we go home and we're incredibly harsh on oneself. I mean, that's just a perfect example. I show up with the intention of being compassionate, but then who I am inside for myself is really harsh and critical. That is what I certainly mean by acknowledging the inauthentic way of being that we automatically have. Like, every human being's not naturally just born authentic. You just don't go out there. No. Actually, we're inherently born inauthentic. Who we are is not really true to ourselves. And therefore it's a practice to acknowledge those areas where I'm not being really true to myself here. Am I not being really true to myself? So that's certainly the first thing. For me, though, the authentic piece comes really from the practice. Again, like it's a practice. It's like to acknowledge what's really there for me in any point in time is what it is to be authentic. And that quote, really, I do think it came off the back of my storytelling. My willingness to tell my own stories really does occur as that's an authentic leader. Like, when I show up, one of the things that really surprises people, because of my experience of being with people, like, the truth of the really matter. Like, if I really had to dig down deep, right, the truth of the matter is I love people, right? I really, really love being with people. Now, my automatic wiring as a human being and what I have to deal with on a regular basis is actually how much I am scared of people. And how afraid I am of other human beings, and how unsafe I feel around other people, and how much I do not trust people. Like, I am, the automatic show up for me is I have to be careful. I cannot trust people, and I need to be very mindful of what I say, because I will be taken advantage of. Okay. So for me to be authentic really is for me to deal with that as that's not the truth. That is your experience from, your own upbringing and what's happened in your life. And you can now see that. And by seeing that, you have a choice about acknowledging, is it really true that there's anything to be scared of with another human being? Well, in the world of truism, well, no, there's not.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah, no, I love that because it goes back to what you said earlier about people creating their own stories and not really ever knowing what someone else's story is, because nobody up to this point of watching this video or listening to this, no one would ever guess that you would just say what you just said.
No, right.
You know, you would never
Exactly.
presuppose that, because you would expect just the opposite, because
Yes.
you're so you appear to be so outgoing, well-spoken, educated. Nobody would ever guess that. So
Yeah,
I
well-
just love that you brought that up.
Oh, well,
I appreciate
thank you.
that.
And you know, and that's the other part, I guess, if we use some of the general the social norms of labels, right? You know,
Right.
by labeling, I am an introvert.
Yeah.
I don't like going to parties. I don't like socializing. I would rather sit in front of a movie or get engaged in research and sit behind the scenes. It is for me, but though that automatic kind of set of habits doesn't align with what I discovered in terms of my commitment to make a difference. And I can still very much choose to, and I still, there are definitely times for me where I absolutely need to take that step back and have that time for myself. So I'm very conscious of making sure I have practices in my life to make sure I you know, exercise well, eat well, get plenty of rest, meditate, swim. You know, I have to put those things in place because I've had an entire lifetime of being trained to, you know, to keep myself separate.
Right. No, I understand that 100%.
Yes.
Adam's our extrovert on the show, I think.
Right.
Oh, thanks. Well, it's funny. I've thought about that a bit recently, you know, where would I fall? Because I certainly hear you, Kylie, in that it's good to reflect and go, what do I need, you know? Because I find from time to time it's important for me to get energy from others, but then sometimes I get too much energy from others and it overwhelms me, and then I need to take a step back. So in a way, it's kind of understanding what you need, and just, you know, so if you say, for example, say I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert, or I would probably classify myself as an ambivert, is it's just know that you're going to need different things, you know, because sometimes, yeah, like being at home, being with yourself, you might need others to kind of give you some more energy to pump you up. So it's tricky, but it comes back, as you said, knowing yourself, I think.
Yeah.
But I do have to say kudos to you for being so open and honest. And I think that's something other podcast hosts have called you out for, you know, your vulnerability and honesty and authenticity, to say, you know, outward appearance is on this very, you know, powerful, you know, speaker who can, you know, craft a lot of stories, but deep down, I'm really conflicted every day with how I interact with people, because there's so many people out there right now, I'm sure, going through the same conflicts, but not knowing, you know, or not feeling comfortable to share that. But the more you do that, the more it normalizes it and people feel more connected, I think. So, so definitely kudos to you for taking that step.
Yeah, thank you. And look, for me, it really is that anyone can do it, you know, and for me, that's really the pinnacle about my view on leadership. You know, I really, anyone in my view is capable and has what it takes to be a leader. And, you know, I think if people are to see that it's possible, then they will take the action. If it occurs to them that it's not possible, like if I never said anything like that and people looked at me, they would make assumptions about that it must be part of my DNA to just rock up like that. And that gives them no access whatsoever. You know, anyone who has heard the story of my upbringing would be shocked that many go, my God, you are a miracle, really. You know, at 6 different schools in the first 7 years of my life. My mother was 16 when I was born. I have no registered father on my birth certificate. I had 2 stepfathers. I was sexually abused at 12 years old. You know, I didn't get a formal education when I left high school because I was too scared to go out by my own. I mean, you know, I could go on. You know, and so who I am is, you know what, really, the worst of the worst could happen to you, and I have nothing but compassion for the awful, awful things that happen in life to human beings, myself included. And that has nothing to do with what's possible in your life.
Yeah, I love that. Love that.
Wow, that's good. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just taking a moment.
I know.
You know what? I feel you. I feel you. You know, I had a conversation last week with a gentleman, and he was sharing his story with me, and I had the same thing. I was like, that. I'm like, sorry, I'm just kind of getting what, like, the power of what you just said. Like, I'm really, you know, because there's a lot, right? Like, really, I want, and for me to be responsible for that, Adam, right? Like, I've just dropped a couple of big bombshells that for anyone who, you know, the conversation of sexual abuse, put it that way, right? If we only need to put that in the context of sexual harassment in the workplace and the Me Too movement, we only need to put that in the context of the Black Lives Matters movements and the deaths that we've seen in the and the just recently in Colorado, you know, the man who kind of went crazy and shot people. I mean, really, you know, when those things get expressed, it creates a world of impact. And that's what I mean. You know, look, life is full of stuff, you know, very big, important and impactful things. And I'm not saying dismiss it, actually quite the opposite, you know, but it is to say that there really is, you know, we can be that, you know, settle for oneself, you know, we really can be that, you know, like really life's great, and it's then a choice to say, well, it's just, I'm going to choose it as not an option. Why? Well, because I have a commitment to having something else available,
right?
And I, you know, I just think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, like I said, everybody has a very different story and what's happened in their life, but ultimately, you know, when you do the work for yourself, really you can create anything.
Yeah.
Well, I think as well, in part of my reaction, and again, I think in kind of podcasts and stuff, we feel almost a commitment to be professional and not respond. But I think it's so important to, if your mind's blown or you feel very, like, I don't know, overwhelmed with something or a story, you just need to kind of express that. But I liked in what you said, like there was a power in it, right? That you can have this really difficult upbringing, but you still ultimately have the power to craft where you are today. Just because, you know, those foundations were really difficult, you can still navigate through them. It's not going to be easy, but I think there's a power to that. And it's nice to hear that, because so many people would probably say, look, I've had such a bad upbringing, such a bad past. I can't move forward. I'm stuck. That's who I am. This is part of my identity. But it's nice to think, no, you have the power inside yourself to now shift that narrative and take it down a completely new path, like a really nice life-changing path. So there was a lot of power in that.
Yes. And that, look, it's not easy, but those things that happen, there is a point that you get to where compassion comes into it. There's a practice of forgiveness. And I went through that for myself with the abuse, where I not only, you know, because as a child at that age, what happens with abuse is we blame ourselves, you know, that we shouldn't have, you know, whatever that looks like. And so for me, there was a real need for me to forgive myself for not making myself wrong for that. But then once I navigated that, it was then the forgiveness of the other person involved for it happening, not like a condoning that, but really a forgiveness from a completely different domain. And it's very difficult to even get that if you've not gone through that process, and until you go through that process. Right. Because one would say there's just no way, you know, and how it was just no way, you know. But the thing that I did discover, Adam, is that in even the worst of things that happen, there is a life that does get created as a result of that, and it does define and shape who we become. And for me, when I did do that, I did discover that out of that became a very resilient, very strong, very courageous human being. I really, you know, on the one hand, I became very silent for myself because I didn't say anything to anyone about it. So on the one hand, the weakness for me was I decided that it wasn't safe for me to speak up about anything. But then on the flip side, who I became for myself was incredibly determined, incredibly fearless and courageous. And I look back and I go, right, the best thing to do now is to embrace what came of that as one of the greatest strengths that I've got, and to nurture and focus on that, you know, instead of focusing on the whatnot, you know.
What would you say? This question is just in my head because it is such a hard thing for people to, when you're in that circumstance, to see your way out of it. And knowing that you've been there, what advice would you give to someone? Like, what's the first step to take to start to empower yourself again and start to see that there is another side in life and there's, you know, better things to come, so to speak?
Yeah, my number one advice: don't do it alone. Don't try to work it out yourself.
Yeah,
because you're only talking to yourself about yourself.
Yeah,
so you
true,
don't
right.
you don't have an access into anything else, really. Even if you are trying to work through that yourself, or even with a friend, you're still really dealing with your view about that. The only way to disrupt that is to get a completely different view. And there are a plethora of ways you could do that. You know, there are, I mean, look at the, you know, we're in this world now where personal development programs, let's just go back to Tony Robbins for one, right? I mean, you don't have to have had a serious thing happen. It can be a little thing that happened that prevents you, you know. I've seen some miraculous stuff happen in some of Tony Robbins things. So you've got this whole personal development industry that's out there that's easily accessible. Then you've got coaching. I mean, the coaching market these days is also like, wow, it's just what that, you know, that didn't exist 20 years ago when I was coming into the corporate world. And the coaches, what's a coach? Was somebody you did when you played sport. That was it, right?
Exactly.
But now you've got, you know, I mean, Better Health, you know, was it Better Up that was just, you know, Harry's thing that he's now gone out on. And, you know, there's technology solutions that give you direct access to AI technology that allows you to shift everything. And, you know, I'm a big advocate for those, by the way. In fact, I am an ambassador for the resilient side of one that has that AI technology, all from your own app, immediate access into a conversation as if you're talking to someone, not yourself.
Wow.
But then look, I do, you know, I highly am a big advocate for professional help if it's required. And I've seen psychiatrists, I've seen psychologists, I've seen an expert in trauma. You know, a guy out of the States wrote a book called The Body Keeps Score, you know, working with war veterans, and I went for that treatment. I went for the, you know, because I was in the no free will from a physical point of view, and you know they call it eye movement desensitization. And so, you know, I'm not sitting here at all for one and saying, you know, it's light on, you know, depending on what you're dealing with, you got to do the right. All I would say is, number one, don't do it alone. And number two, do what's wanted and needed for you, and find the right kind of resource for you that you think is the right thing. And if that's a health professional, go that path. If it's a coach, go that path. If it's something else, go that path.
Yeah, awesome. Great advice.
There's been lots of fantastic advice in there.
I know.
I just want to change the direction of the conversation slightly. Was just around Team Women Australia. So I know you founded that in 2014, and I recently heard you coming into International Women's Day talk about some of the initiatives that you were doing. But just for our listeners / viewers, can you maybe unpack a little bit more for us what kind of inspired you to start that movement, and where you're moving to next?
Yeah, so that started after my the difficulty I faced in returning to work after having 3 children. Is when it started. And I had, you know, done the traditional pathway in terms of my career and left college and went to school, and then you'd work hard and then you'd prove yourself and you'd climb the next ladder and get promoted, etc. And you know, I was the marketing and strategy director at the time for News Corp, and I was working full time right through to my second child. You know, I loved my job. I had my first child slept really well, and so I went back to work early, and then after my second child, I still wanted to work, and so I did that really well, and I had great support to do that. And then the moment I had my third child, however, I remember very clearly walking into the office of my boss after my third child was 10 months old, because I was desperate to get out of the house. Oh my God, just give me something other than this, right?
Right.
And so I walked back in asking for my job back on a part-time basis. And he said, I need somebody full-time. And I said, well, I really can't give you full-time. I want part-time, and I want my job back part-time. And he said, and despite attempting to do that, that didn't work. I was successful in making the request to split my role. So what happened was I took the strategy, they kept the marketing operations piece, and so I worked 3 days a week. But what happened was I lost all the parts of the job that I loved. I no longer had my team. I was in this corner office with no staff, and not only that, it was sitting outside of the executive boardroom where my executive team would have the meetings, and there I was sitting on the outside, a bit like, what's that, Jennifer Houseman, or in, Baby and Dirty Dancing.
Oh, yeah. No one puts Baby in the corner.
No one puts Baby in the corner, right? Never. I was like, in the corner.
No one puts Kylee in the corner.
No, I'm not sitting in the corner. So
right.
I went through this kind of period of about maybe 2 or 3 months, just being incredibly resentful, incredibly bitter. I was like, oh, what was my life? Like that kind of crisis point, and I thought, I got to do something. And so I started I'd been coaching that at that stage, about 10 years. And I was like, right, it's time to put this back onto myself and start to look from what's the what next for me? What is it that I'm working towards as my what next? And so I started doing that for myself. And bizarrely enough, I was getting coffee at work, and a lady came up to me, asked me how I was, and true to my nature, I said shit. I was like, awful. I didn't do the let's just paint the pretty picture. Right. Yeah, no, I'm good, thanks. Move on. No. I was very honest with her about that. I told her flatly, I'm really annoyed and bitter, resentful that, here I am after 20 years, and, all of a sudden, just because I can't give them 5 days instead of 3 days, I have to be parked, and I'm not doing all these things that I love. And she's like, oh my goodness, me too. And I was like, oh, really? I said, what are you doing? She says, nothing. I was like, why? Yeah. She's like, well, what are you doing? And I just started sharing with her some of the practical things that I was doing to kind of put myself back together and reform and reinvent myself for my what's next. And she says, like, oh, that sounds amazing. And I said, well, hey, I'm happy to share with you if you want to do anything. And I just finished reading Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, and she had she's got this platform called the Lean In Community. Okay. And I said, I had three, and long story short, I had a few other people asking the same thing, right? Can you mentor one of my staff? Sure. So I was like, hey, why don't we use this platform? We'll all jump in, and I'll start the conversation. I'll share with you some of the stuff I'm doing, and blah, blah, blah. That went from a conversation of 5 to 6 people to 53 women in the space of 6 weeks. And
oh, wow.
So I ended up literally hosting it like a mentoring situation, where I'd run these webinars on a weekly basis, and we'd just talk. And even though we were doing all these activities, where the power was in the communication. Was actually just simply talking about how things were really going, and women giving feedback and making suggestions. And one woman was wanting to write a book and tell a story. And I was like, why don't we have an event? And why don't you share your story with this? And she was not lacking in confidence to share it public. And I said, oh, we can all just put it together. I said, we only need to invite one friend each, and we got, 100 women. Would you be willing to? She's like, yes. But of course, I don't do anything in halves. So she says yes. And I went, right, we need to find 4 other women and organise them to come and speak. So I went looking for other women who had gone, broken some barrier and, achieved something. And, so we had a world-class, athlete, and we had a whole range of women at this event. We ended up with 160 women at the event, not 100. Oh, wow. And it was electrifying. And everyone at the end of it said, oh my God, we got to just do this again. And that's how Team Women happened. So we were like, let's do it again. Let's call it something. And we were like, storytelling really is a very powerful way for women to, we don't need to fix women. We don't need to change women. We don't need to give them more professional development. They're incredibly smart already. They, blah, blah, blah. Actually, all that's needed and wanted is really an opportunity for them to communicate in a way where they feel free and safe to do so.
Yeah, so that's huge.
that's really the intention behind that. And so ever since doing that, you know, we'd run some workshops, or we now on the platform itself, it really is at this, you know, ideally for us, it would be a digital thing, much like TED, where we would have the video stories of women told. I mean, that's a costly exercise. We tried to do that, but then when I put all my eggs in that basket, a bit like you know, you're not for profit, you're not making any money of that. And it was a content platform. It wasn't we weren't selling anything.
Right.
So it's just been a really long journey for me, because it really ultimately all it was about was telling women's stories. So it's been a very slow process. Now that I'm kind of building up my primary practice, my intention is, you know, to kind of mobilize that as much as we can with more mentoring and with technology and stories, and that's really our mission.
Yeah, so that's with the performance code that you're doing that?
Yeah, so performance code was where I started putting my primary coaching practice work, working with executives and leaders, applying all these things like the neuroscience of resilience into performance, and creating visions and missions as a leader. But it was predominantly one-on-one, but then some group work with organizations. That was all good and well until COVID, as you can imagine.
Sure. Well, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So during COVID, I was 10 days off facilitating to the senior executives at Qantas here. And then I got a phone call. Kylie, I'm really sorry, but 20,000, we are going to have to let go 20,000 staff, and we need to put this on hold. Right. So all of a sudden, you know, really everything just disappeared from my business because it was all out of learning and development, all out of people's personal budgets. And so it just it disappeared. And so during that time, I did as any good strategist does. I went back to the operating model of my vision and looked for, okay, what is the next way to deal with this? Is this the future for me? Yeah. And I made the decision that it wasn't. I thought, actually, I'm going to have a bigger impact if I actually have people take the money out of their budgets from their marketing expense, because one of the things that I discovered is that as a result of doing the work, you accelerate growth. So then when I started to look, right, and business growth, so I was like, actually, that's not a learning and development investment, that's a marketing investment. If you're actually going to invest in the growth of your business, let's stop working on you as an individual. Let's apply this to working with you as leaders and on building the brand. And in the process of building the brand, we're going to work on creating the future. So let's get everybody's attention off themselves, get them anchored on being aligned on the vision and values and the purpose of the company. And surprisingly, as you probably know, most companies, they've got value statements on their walls, and they've got that people are not operating consistent with that. In fact, for the most part, people don't see those values as something that's part of who they are in their life. But when you do that work, it is profound.
I can imagine
the movement that happens with, you know, it's like Derek Sivers. Have you seen the Derek Sivers TED Talk Start a Movement?
No, I haven't.
Wow, like that's a real demonstration right there of one individual just really releasing their passion for something, and then mobilizing an individual. Like it really just takes one individual, and then one individual and one individual. And that's exactly what it's like when you do the work to align people on a very clear vision, a very clear purpose. Like when you get the purpose statement absolutely clear for people, you don't have to direct anyone. They will be in action, you know, forwarding an outcome. And that's where I think so that's kind of now where I've shifted my attention, is kind of doing more of that stuff.
Okay, man, that just sounds very fascinating. It's like we could have a whole episode just on that, I'm sure.
Definitely. Well, one question, and kind of going back to the Team Women Australia, because I feel like this is a question I've had for a long time, and it's just trying to find the right person to ask it to, and somebody that I think is open to have the conversation without maybe the political kind of stuff behind it, right? So I've, you know, in my leadership journey while I was in the bank, I've had quite a few leaders, and I'd have to say the leaders that I've always probably gelled really well with, it was more an interplay, I suppose, of masculine or feminine, right? And you know, say if I had probably the best leader I've ever had, who's a really good mate of mine, so he's a male leader, but very much demonstrates some wonderful feminine traits. So compassion and empathy, and is very interested in taking the time to hear someone's story, you know, which is something that I suppose in the corporate world sometimes gets missed. People are so driven about like productivity and things. But then on the other side, I can think about some women leaders that I've had that have tried to very much demonstrate some masculine qualities, which I can certainly say would be because the structures are so very immersed in, you know, they're so masculine, the structures. And it almost, in a way, I could see a couple of leaders that were trying to almost go against their natural kind of feminine tendencies, you know, for compassion or empathy. And that, it just created quite an inauthentic leadership for me. And I found that I didn't work as well with those people. So for me, I guess the question is like, what are your thoughts on that? You know, like, I know obviously from a structural point of view, it's a very masculine world. And I think we really needed definitely a movement towards more feminine leadership. But I just wondered what your thoughts were that, and whether working with women, you've seen that kind of interplay, I suppose, where they might try and move towards more masculine tendencies.
So I guess this is probably going to be, this could be considered quite controversial.
Yes,
but,
yes.
We like that.
There was a time in our evolution when there was no such thing as gender.
Okay.
Didn't exist until someone, and this is the power of language, until someone declared it into existence.
Yeah.
And in the creation of that existence, a whole world got created about what is male, what is female. And now we live in a society where there is a view we live into, not like a reality, but a view that we form about what's masculine, what's feminine. And then just because we now have this view about what's masculine and what's feminine, as soon as someone shows up, as soon as you see a man, you've got an automatic view, a judgment, a stereotype, a creation about how you think that man is. But guess what? That's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
No, just because you're seeing someone who looks a certain way, who has certain physical attributes, whose body is shaped and got all these things, right? You now have a view called, you think that person is a particular way, right? Same goes with a woman. We now have this view called femininity is a particular way, and feminine have certain attributes and qualities. And then we see a woman, or we see someone who has, you know, long hair and boobs and, you know, whatever. And we go, automatically, we have an assumption about that, right?
Yeah.
Quite frankly, I think that's the source of the problem. So I would rather, and, you know, look, I am not the expert on this domain at all. So, you know, in one aspect, who am I to say? But, you know, I was raised in an era that was still very much the patriarchal, you know, traditional male structured approach, right?
Yeah.
Did I have a problem with that when I was 21? No, I did not. Was there a conversation when I was 21 about how that was created by men and it was masculine and it's not a feminine place? No, there was not.
Yeah.
In fact, if we were to look at the media and the coverage and the movements and all of that stuff, that is very recent. Very recent. In the game of evolution, that is very recent. And the more, and this is the part that's going to be controversial, the more we put in gender into anything, the more we are going to continue this separation, this separating of self from humanity. And quite frankly, I just think we got to stop it. You know, I've got 2 boys and a daughter. I don't call myself a female leader. I am a leader. I don't call myself a female entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur. I don't call them, you're a male football player. I mean, my daughter plays rugby league and soccer, you know, whatever. But I think we just got to deal with, if you're being a great human being, you know, just because you're compassionate doesn't mean that's a feminine trait. And look, sure, there's, you know, look, we've even gone and created an entire industry of research to justify these are masculine traits and these are feminine traits. I mean, come on, you know, and look, I'm sure biologically, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, from a scientific point of view, absolutely. I get all of that. but come on, can we not just say that if you're true to yourself, right?
Right.
You really are true to who you are and you express yourself freely. Do you really need to put yourself into a bucket of whether that's more male, more female? How are you going to show up when a male, and how are you going to show up? Do we really need to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
That's just my view.
It's a wonderful, wonderful answer. It's quite good because it's really shone the light on something I hadn't thought about, I guess. And so maybe it's I don't know, because it was playing on my mind for a long time, the whole masculine, feminine thing. And I think it was almost a barrier in a way in how I understood maybe leadership over the years and what defines good leadership. But I think, as you say, maybe the problem is in that title piece. It's saying masculine, feminine leadership, as opposed to, is that person being authentic in themselves? And that's maybe where the disconnect is. So no, thank you. That's good. A good answer, which one that I can go and reflect on some more. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So do we need to wrap things up here, Kylie? We
probably
don't want to
do.
keep you too long.
Well, I suppose I probably don't want to keep people. They probably might be a bit bored with me now. So
No, I don't think that's possible.
So.
No. We could talk to you probably for another couple hours, but we want to respect your time.
Quite a few other questions, so we're gonna have to do Kylie part 2 at some stage.
But is there Kylie, is there anything you want to share before we wrap things up here? Anything we haven't covered yet?
Well, look, I mean, we've covered a lot. And like you say, there's so many things that we could talk about. I guess the only thing I would just leave for people is really just, to be true to yourself at the end of the day. And, it is very easy for us to get stuck on feeling like we don't have a say, or we don't have any control, or we don't make, there's no point in saying anything because it's not going to make any difference. And I think, in the face of all of that, I think what's really important is to know that actually, yes, everything you say, everything you do, whether it's in the privacy of your own home or whether it's out there in the world, every single thing that an individual does matters. Mm-hmm. And I think to point to anything that would help people really get that for themselves. There was a poem written about a boy who was walking along a beach with the starfish. There was this ocean was just washing up all these starfish, and you could say there was millions of them, right? And he's walking along, picking one up at a time, throwing it back in the ocean. And this old man walks down from the other side. By the way, I don't know why they both were boys, but they were, right? Just in case anyone's now going to call me on that one. But there was an old man walking down the other way towards this little boy, and he says to him, "Why are you doing that? There's just no chance that you've got of saving them." And he picked one up, and he said, it makes a difference to this one.
Yeah. Love it.
So every single thing that you do that we do as an individual does matter, and it does have an impact. We are more connected than I think that we can realize. And if we take that view for ourselves, then I think that's really how we start to see change at a much bigger macro level.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great way to close the show. I
was going to say that. Yes, exactly. You have any concluding thoughts, Adam, before I give a sign off?
No.
All right. Well, first, we want to thank Kylie very much for being here. It's been awesome to talk to you, and we had to rework our schedules a few times here, so we appreciate you sticking with us through it. And again, you can find us, as Adam said at the beginning of the show, you can find us on YouTube, Amazon Music, Spotify. You can jump over to Coffee and give us as little as $1 to help us keep this thing going. You can reach us at cheerstonotsettling@gmail.com. So that's all our plugs. So we'll just say until next time, cheers to not settling.
Thank you.
Cheers to not settling.
I love it.